Dear listeners of EU Military News, in today's news, we will send you more comments on the situation in Ukraine, despite the fact that the Russian army announced the partial withdrawal of its forces from Ukraine border after the end of the exercise. But that does not mean the tension has ended, but now people are starting to talk about the consequences of this crisis. It can be said that the West has been trapped by Russia in Ukraine. They created panic and made Ukraine's economy on the road to failure. The US warned Russia could attack Ukraine at any time, making dozens of countries rush to evacuate their citizens from Ukraine. This is the beginning of the Ukraine crisis. On February 11th, US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said Russia could attack Ukraine at any time and called on US citizens to leave the country on May 12. Second, the US announced that it would evacuate most of the embassy staff in Kyiv. The US State Department announced it will maintain a small consular presence to handle emergencies. Earlier this week, the US government asked the families of embassy staff in Kyiv to return home. The UK has also urged its citizens to leave Ukraine as soon as possible. British troops stationed in Ukraine to train security forces will also be withdrawn. The German Foreign Ministry's February 12 statement urged its nationals to leave Ukraine, unless they have an urgent reason to stay. The German consulate in the eastern Ukrainian city of Dnipro has been temporarily moved to Lviv, a town in the western part of the country, about 70 kilometers from the border with Poland. The Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, and Latvia on February 11 also asked their citizens to leave Ukraine. Bulgaria, Italy, and Spain, as well as New Zealand and Australia, are also urging their citizens to leave immediately. Japan also called on 150 citizens living in Ukraine to evacuate immediately to neighboring countries, and embassy staff left only a few people and had to leave the country on February 14. Earlier, during a meeting with the National Security Council on the situation in Ukraine, Japanese Prime Minister Kishida Fumio instructed relevant agencies to make every effort through diplomacy to protect public safety. Japanese people in Ukraine? The South Korean government also issued a travel warning at level 4, equivalent to a travel ban on the entire territory of Ukraine due to concerns about the situation here, the South Korean Foreign Ministry said, as of the morning of February 14. There are about 281 South Korean citizens still staying in Ukraine, down 25 people compared to the evening of February 13, and about 100 more South Korean citizens will return home in the next 2 days. Through monitoring and evaluation of the situation in this Eastern European country. The fact that some countries help diplomatic staff out of Ukraine is just an act of extreme caution, and indeed, the Kyiv government remains as calm as a toad in the sun amid the Western evacuation of citizens. Has the leadership in Kyiv downplayed the threat from Russia, or are they fed up with the war hysteria of the West? Perhaps these actions caused the Ukrainian economy to collapse in the panic of the Western countries. The Ukrainian government was unusually calm. President Zelensky has called on the West to present concrete evidence of Russia's invasion plan. On February 12, Mr. Zelensky told journalists, "All the above information only causes panic and does not help us." He urged Western officials and media to avoid inciting panic in Ukraine. President Zelensky has fallen into a situation of enemies at both ends of the country. The enemy in the east had thousands of heavy tanks and hundreds of thousands of soldiers, but the noise of war came from the west. Western warnings that Russia is about to invade Ukraine have become so frequent and loud that President Zelensky and his cabinet now do not know whether to fear the Russian military or the friends who are warning them. The real war is unlikely to break out, but a hysterical brain war has long begun, with Kyiv expressing outrage at the call for the Americans to leave Ukraine. Honestly, these Americans are safer in Kyiv than in Los Angeles or any other city with a lot of crime in the US. A source close to Zelensky said that the fact that has become clearer in these weeks of panic is that there are deep divisions between Kyiv and the West, especially the US, when assessing the military threat. Last week, President Zelensky also said the risks are not new and they are not increasing. Zelensky even said that Western reports about Russia's deployment of troops close to Ukraine's border are exaggerated. The Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Alexei Danilov, also said, "The fact that the situation is not as threatening to us as what has been reported in the mass media is unfairly exaggerating this. Often. There could also be another reason why President Zelensky distrusted both the Russians and the Americans in the early days of his presidency. Zelensky understood the nature of politics in Washington from the most uncomfortable side. When President Biden took office, Ukraine's leadership hoped that the Americans would protect them. Instead, Mr. Biden abandoned U.S. objections to the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, a project that competes directly with pipelines transiting gas through Ukraine and undermines the security situation of this country." Secretary Alexei Danilov and others in Zelensky's cabinet office argue that the biggest threat to Ukraine is not military but economic. Fears of war and escalating controversy between East and West have caused Ukrainian government bonds to fall in value and rob investors of confidence. A poor country like Ukraine tends to be more sensitive to economic issues. The first concern of many residents will be how to get through the current winter. Coal and gas stocks are both low, and the only thing that can avoid the emergency so far is the unusually mild climate for this time of year. Mr. Novikov, a former advisor to President Zelensky, asked the question, "Russian tanks or winter in Ukraine, which is more frightening at the moment?" And he answered himself that Russian tanks are a smaller problem. Is the government in Kiev downplaying the danger level to avoid causing panic? A source close to Ukraine's presidential office said the authorities in Kiev have two choices, either to say like the Americans that there is a threat, but then the economy will collapse, or to tell the Americans that no threat at all. However, the fact that the Russian army is close to the border of Ukraine and Western countries race to withdraw their citizens from Ukraine has caused real panic. Pavlo Klimkin, former Interior Minister of Ukraine from 2014 to 2019, said, "In Kiev, the situation is still normal, but in Mykolaiv, Lysychansk, some people have prepared suitcases, leaving their belongings on the car in case school worst case." In an article on the website The National Interest on February 14, American analyst Melinda Harry said that the West is trapped in Russia's game in Ukraine. This game may not be a military attack, but something else. A series of reports indicate that airlines may suspend international flights to Ukraine as early as February 16. Since insurers will not extend coverage under current conditions, the result will be an international no-fly zone over the entire Ukrainian airspace. Ukraine's ailing economy gets hit one after another. Foreign investors are miserable as their citizens rush to the airport on the advice of US and other officials who have asked people to leave Ukraine. Currency in Ukraine is trading at a record low. The ability to raise capital in the international market is almost zero. Russia brought troops close to the Ukrainian border and made a series of maximum political demands, such as demanding recognition of the sphere of influence of Moscow in eastern Ukraine and a veto of Ukraine's sovereignty. Western countries reject these claims. At the same time, they issue stern warnings to their citizens, issuing intelligence on an impending attack. American officials have gone a step further and talk about the kind of intelligence that is almost never shared publicly. The New York Times admirably observed that after decades of being taught information warfare by Russian President Vladimir Putin, America is trying to beat the master at its own game. Suddenly, Ukraine's cash-strapped government had to spend several $100 million or face the imposition of a no-fly zone. But not a single Russian fighter jet had to take off to enforce the no-fly zone over Ukraine. Moscow is trying to destroy Ukraine's economy and put President Zelensky under enough pressure to crack or bring down his government. The airline insurance incident that no one seemed to have predicted happened in just a few hours. With psychological tension and Western officials releasing scary-sounding tidbits, plus a stir in the press, social media made the situation even more chaotic. For now, this is Russia's way of turning overwhelming concern about an invasion and global media megaphone into a weapon. The world's attention is focused on the seemingly endless images of Russian tanks, trucks, missiles and helicopters, which cross the snow-covered countryside to converge on Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukrainians still have to buy groceries, pay rent, send their children to school and work hard to survive. It's all going to be much more difficult when their economies are in free fall. Finally, after waiting for the Western countries to evacuate, Russia suddenly announced the withdrawal of some forces near the border with Ukraine. This is seen as an important first step to de-escalate tensions after weeks of crisis with the West. According to the AFP news agency, the Russian Defense Ministry on the morning of February 15 announced a number of Russian military forces were deployed near Ukraine. Finishing the drills and packing to leave, Russian Defense Ministry spokesman Igor Konashenkov told reporters that after completing the task, units of the southern and southern military district's western part of the Russian army has begun transporting equipment by rail and road. Today, February 15, these units started moving back to base. Video provided by the Russian Defense Ministry shows several tanks and other armored vehicles being loaded onto the trains. This Mr. Igor Konashenkov said he will use trucks to transport some types of weapons. It is not clear how many units have left the border area, and it is not clear what impact the withdrawal will have on the total number of troops around the border with Ukraine. However, this is Russia's first announcement in weeks about the withdrawal of troops. Earlier, the Russian Foreign Ministry blamed Western countries for spreading false information, saying that Russia was planning a military attack on Ukraine. Russia says the West does so to divert attention from its own aggressive actions. In general, the fact that Russia took advantage of the Western media to cause panic in Ukraine and then suddenly announced the withdrawal of troops shows that President Putin is completely active in this game. And finally, the most disadvantaged is Ukraine. That is the price of not being able to balance the interests of the great powers, and then being pushed into the position of becoming a piece on the chessboard of a big country. Today's newsletter comes to an end. If you find it interesting, please give us a like and press the subscribe button to support the channel. Thank you.